Good evening. My name is Michael Rubenstein, and on behalf of Yes in Brookline, I'd like to welcome you, whether you are on site or online, to tonight's forum, Housing for All, For-Profit and Nonprofit Developer Perspectives. Yes in Brookline is a coalition of organizations and people who come together to explore priorities and solutions around the challenges of housing and land use in Brookline. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's forum, Brookline Community Development Corporation, Brookline for Everyone, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, GBIO Brookline, the Brookline Housing Advisory Board, the Brookline Housing Authority, and the Brookline Planning Board. I'd also like to recognize Mike Sandman of the Select Board, who is here this evening. Tonight's discussion with two experienced developers who call Brookline home will be moderated by Cathleen Cavell, a longtime town meeting member and former associate town council. Please silence your electronic devices now. If you have a question that you would like to raise during the forum, those of you online can enter questions into the Q&A section of the webinar and enter your question there. If you are in the room, there are monitors in the aisles with cards and pens. Raise your hand if you would have a question and then write it on the card and return it to the monitor. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of tonight's discussion. Thank you all for joining us. And now please welcome our moderator, Cathleen Cavell.
Thank you, Michael. The lack of sufficient homes that most people can afford, middle income and market rate as well as lower income housing, including rentals and condos and more, is clearly a crisis in Brookline, in Massachusetts, and countrywide. Our children and young families cannot hope to find housing in Brookline, and parents and grandparents do not find a place to downsize they can afford. Lively, vibrant communities require sufficient housing for every stage of life. Our goal is localities where children grow up and stay, parents age in their home communities, grandchildren live nearby, and people know and look out for their neighbors. However we choose to address our challenges, developers of multi-unit housing play a vital role by adding homes in our communities. New housing requires both for-profit and nonprofit developers to plan, finance, design, get permissions, build, market, and manage. Developers are an essential element of creating more homes. Tonight, we hope to learn about challenges developers face in Brookline and elsewhere, and how we can help them help us achieve the community we want. Yes in Brookline and our other sponsors are fortunate to have two accomplished, experienced developers, both Brookline residents, to discuss the hurdles they face as they plan and build new housing, and I'll briefly introduce each of them. Amy Schectman is Chief Executive Officer of Two Life Communities, a leading nonprofit developer and manager that creates affordable communities in and near Boston. You may know Brookline's Brown Family House at 370 Harvard Street, next to Kehilloth Israel, at the corner of William Street. Amy's held senior positions in public housing and capital planning for the Commonwealth. She served as planning director at the Brookline Housing Authority and spent 8 years as Brookline's first economic development director. She holds a bachelor's in political science from Johns Hopkins and a master's in city planning from MIT. She's raised 3 sons in North Brookline, where she and her husband still live. And when she worked for Brookline, her proudest achievement was bringing Trader Joe's to us. Just found that out. Very important. Thank you. Thank you. You can hear me in the back? Good. Zeina Talje has over 20 years' experience as a designer architect in design, development, finance, and asset management for Fortune 500 local and national firms. She founded Zeta Insight, a real estate development and investment firm focused on multi-unit projects of less than 50 units with superior energy performance. She's a board member of the tech startup Co-Urbanize. Zeina has a master's degree in architecture from McGill and an MBA in real estate finance from Columbia. She holds Massachusetts licenses to sell real estate and as a general contractor, and she's certified as a lead passive house consultant. She serves on Brookline's Economic Development Advisory Board and lives in town with her husband and 2 sons. So, here are some introductory questions that I ask both of you. Perhaps Zeina first. How has your experience in real estate development led to your approach to creating multifamily housing?
Thanks, Kathleen, for your kind introduction, and thanks, Michael, and everyone for organizing this seminar. I really came into real estate early on in my career as a designer, as an architect, and I couldn't understand why what we studied at school we couldn't actually build. And it took me on a long journey of learning finance and every aspect of the business to come to a place where I realized that it does take an incredibly vast skill set to pull off one building. And oftentimes the metric that we use to measure whether we've been successful or not is constantly changing as our values and as what we think is acceptable changes. But real estate is a passion of mine because I think it's one of the rare industries and spaces where you can actually see what you've worked on come to fruition, and it can have a profound impact on people's lives. We all need housing, we need shelter. We're gonna have to figure out a way to put these bricks together and build something. And you know, no matter how great technology gets, it's still pretty low tech how we put buildings together. I hope that answers what you were hoping for.
It's great, thank you. Amy.
Thanks. So I was thinking about this question a lot since you posed it, and I think I've been so lucky in my career. So I've been at this since 1980, a little bit older. And almost every job I've had, I've worked in a place where when we build it, we also manage it forever. And so when you're doing that, you always think about life cycle costing, you think about the long run, you don't just think about building. It's very different if you build and then don't operate. We build. And so Two Life is a developer, operator, manager, direct service provider, and advocate for policy. And so that really affects. And the other way that just profoundly changes the way you think about everything is, you know, the end users. I can tell you the names of, I can only probably remember about 100, 150 of our 1,800 residents, but you know what you've done for their lives, how their lives have changed by what you can provide. And if that isn't an inspiration to do, and finally, when you're in the kind of position I'm in, you get the calls from or often for us it's the daughters, because we do housing for older adults, crying, begging, you know, I'm number 496 on the waiting list, can't you do something? So the desperation that you feel. And one more point finally, I promise. And the way, as it's evolved since I started in this business, it's gotten more and more complicated and more difficult. You need now 18, 19, maybe you can get away with 16 sources of financing for every development. So when I became CEO, we actually had to create a professional real estate development department because it can't be left for volunteers and amateurs any longer, and that's just a reality. It's way more difficult.
I'm going to ask you about how financing works. And before I do, Zeina, would you tell us what it costs a developer to bring people to a community meeting, if that's part of the process of getting a development approved?
Yeah, I know what seems like a public forum for everyone to come and chat and catch up is actually very costly from the perspective of a developer, because you're presenting design concepts, you're bringing in your traffic engineer, your entire team of very expensive and smart consultants. They're brilliant people to present to the community. And oftentimes, every time you come to a meeting, you're almost starting from the beginning because memories are short. It's hard to keep track of what's changed. And so it is costly in the sense that you could easily be at $2,000 to $10,000 per meeting to show up with armed with your team of experts to present to the community a credible answer from folks who really know what they're doing and what they're talking about, even though oftentimes the answers are so simple that one person can present. But the reason I think for us as developers, it's really important to demonstrate that we're only as good as our team. And we bring them with us to demonstrate that we don't do this alone, that it wasn't sort of what we dreamed up the day before kind of, and it's a very long process of compliance and working with experts in the field and presenting good urban planning principles to the community.
Would you also back up a little bit and explain how developers think about financing and costs? There's something called a pro forma,
Right.
which I had to have explained to me, and I'm not sure I really understand it yet, but I think that's at the root of how developers think about what they're going to do and what it's going to cost and whether it's feasible. Could you tell
Right.
us a little bit about that?
All right.
About financing and costs?
I'm happy to tackle that. I am representing for-profit developers, but kind of the key is that it is very, very rare to find a deal that pencils. And I say that really with utter respect to sort of our industry and what we do, because what people don't realize is it's a very efficient industry. We are competing with other market sectors, and if real estate, because of interest rates or other market conditions, is not competitive and yielding a return, investors will just pull their money into a different sector. And yet real estate is so key for our future and is a need. And this is a bit of the disconnect where you find there's public financing for what Amy does on the senior affordable housing side, but there's really no public financing when it comes to naturally occurring market rate, slightly affordable, accessible housing. But to answer your question on what is a pro forma is a fancy word to say, does this project or development yield enough returns for it to pass the market test, for it to be financeable? A lot of people are involved in a project from the perspective of capital and money, and a developer can have a vision, and a developer is expected to really understand the market. Is really the business. Is there a market need? What can people afford? What can these units sell or rent for? But then are there enough sources in terms of investors who are willing to put money into this project? And will the banks let you borrow so that you can complete it? And the pro forma is this snapshots, this picture frame of your sources and your uses. And what people often lose sight of is they might see at the end what a condo cost, and they're shocked at the price. But they've never seen what the costs were that went into delivering that condo. We sort of all cherry pick the piece that we want to see. And just to kind of, the pro forma is really critical, because when we hit times when the market is so tight that a deal can be a go or no go, is when public policy and our public discourse around what we want to allow becomes so critical to move select projects that we think will actually serve us forward. And I feel that I've seen it in communities where people have that public will to back me up and say, we like what she's proposing and we want to back her up. And these voices are really critical when you're at that tipping point of, is this a go or no go? But the pro forma really is a very important tool, and it's a fancy word, but what you need to do is you need to make sure that your project is viable and sustainable, because good economic development is not just about presenting housing, but it's also ensuring that the housing has a buyer or end user and is sustainable, where the asset can pay its debt and secure its cash flow. And that's really the job of a developer, is also the financial engineering and the ensuring the viability of a project, because you don't want to commit and then not, pull it off.
Did you want to add something to this, Amy? Because I see you're making notes.
Oh, I'm just making notes about other points to get in later.
Okay. Beyond high interest rates and construction costs, what else must happen in order for housing to be developed?
Well, first you have to have a site that can handle the density. Now, you do smaller projects. For us, we really can't do a project that's anything less than 60 apartments. And to be honest, we only did Brookline, which is only 60. It's our smallest project, because I live here and I really wanted to be in Brookline, and it's close enough to Brighton. Really, for us, anything less than 100 apartments makes it very hard to deliver the kind of services and programs that you can amortize over the, so site is really critical. Then the conditions for permitting. Is the town friendly? Is the town hostile? Going back to your question about how much this costs, I just did some research to come tonight. So we have a project, we're almost done with construction in Waltham. This was a unique project in that we had no opponents. There were no neighbors opposing us. And yet, we spent $100,000 on the legal costs to get the permit. I want to contrast that with a project we're building in Lynn, where there's as-of-right multifamily zoning. And at that project, which is 115 units, so substantially larger, we are saving in our budget $200,000 by having the as-of-right zoning. So the climate in which you're going to permit, how long it's going to take, what it's going to cost you, and how many hours, which we don't even, that's not factored in my hours or our staff hours. And then you have to look at, of course, the demand and whether people are going to come in. And for us, then the critical thing is, where are we going to score on the public score? You know, when you apply for funding, are we going to rank high? Are we going to rank low? Is this a town or a city that the state has said is an opportunity zone or a place they want? And then, and I don't want to get too nitty gritty, when you're looking for federal public funding, and we have to get federal tax credits, there's other scores, which if you're in what's called a difficult to develop area, or what's the other thing? DDA or QCT or qualified census tract, you get extra points on how much you can get. So then we're going to look at, is this in a qualified census tract or a DDA? And we can talk about what those are to see whether it's going to be. And is that location and the product at the prices you're able to offer with the public financing that you get, is that going to score well on all these points? And are you going to get people to come there? And so the banks or the investment firms that are going to buy your tax credits, do they consider this a high risk, a low risk, a good bet, a bad bet? Because you can get, and we can talk about what this means, you can get anywhere from 90 cents to 115 cents on the dollar. So a big, and each cent is about 100,000 in capital, give or take. So then you've got to, all those factors say whether this makes sense. And then there's the emotional one, which I have to tell you is really honestly a big part. I wanted to be in Brookline because I want to grow old here, so I wanted other people who can't afford to. And that probably overrode all those other considerations, if I'm being honest.
Well, honest is what we're hearing tonight.
Can I just add a little bit
Please,
to
do.
what Kathy's saying? I think what you just heard is the complexity of public finance for affordable projects. I think it takes far more skill, actually, to pull off affordable projects, because the capital stack and the amount of paperwork and the application process is remarkable. And I really kind of commend you for just doing that work, because even though we're both in the same industry, I might be a for-profit developer, but we really are in the same business. We have an overhead. We have smart people that we have to pay. We have to deal with inflationary pressures on construction costs, with people who get sick. And then the public meetings add this personal commitment where you're leaving your kids and you're out at night, oftentimes for hours without dinner, talking and trying to solve parking and trying to say, okay, well, trying to really just be present with people's grievances and concerns, and they're valid. And oftentimes we're missing forums where we can talk about our problems or challenges. So development projects become the public forum for all that's wrong in a neighborhood. And it really is sort of really heartwarming that people show up. At the same time, part of the problem is that we're not figuring out a way to communicate our desired collective objectives effectively. And where I see it, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I see it communicated really well is in requests for proposals that towns and cities issue that often take years to compile into one complete document about what the objectives are for a site that might be in the hands of a public entity, like the town of Brookline or the city of Boston. And oftentimes The players who do a really great job are the affordable housing players, because they have mastered that understanding and that communication. On the private developer side, oftentimes I don't have the resources to really get out there and build that community consensus where I'm not an active not-for-profit offering a service and touching people. But what I do know is that I still serve a very big sector of people who are not eligible for affordable housing, and who might have young adults who want to stay close to them. So, but oftentimes it's very difficult to go and advocate for what I do because I'm a for-profit developer. So, automatically I'm kind of in that category that isn't supported by really any public benefit, even though the biggest public benefit is actually just producing housing, and potentially at a scale that's more digestible to the community.
Can I just add one thing? Because I don't think it's only for-profit developers that get painted with a broad brush as greedy and selfish and rich. And so I've gotten that many times. The other factor I forgot to say is how the city or town is going to treat you once you're there. So permitting is one thing, and then it's how's the assessor going to assess you? How is the building department going to issue that building permit? And I will say Brookline is better than some of the, I'm not going to name some of the other cities and towns we're working in, where you can build a building, and in the middle of building it, they say, we changed our mind on what the permit will say. We changed our mind on what the fire code really means. And if you're in the middle of construction, that is a disaster. So Brookline doesn't do that, and I give us credit. Some of the other things are hard in Brookline, taxes and the support sometimes of local folks.
Speaking of the support of local folks, when we spoke, you told me you contrasted the building project here, for which there's obviously a great need. How many people are on the waiting list now for Brown Family House?
896.
Okay.
We turn over 4 to 5 units a year. It's 62 units, 4 to 5 turnover. There are 896 people on the waiting list.
You told me about, you compared this project to the process of building a project in Boston that you're about to complete. Could you just tell us what?
Sure. So we
that
actually did
entailed?
complete the Boston one. So somewhat simultaneously, we're working in Brookline. Brown House is 62 apartments, and it almost completely fits the old footprint of the building we had to demolish to go there. We did have 28 public meetings. Took over 2 years to get the permit. Now, there was a lot of people, some people in this audience who were incredibly supportive, but it took a long time and a lot. At the same time, we were building a 142-unit building with an 11,000 square foot health center, so about twice the size of what was there before in Boston. But Mayor Wu had come in and said affordable housing is a priority. I think it took us 6 months to permit that.
How many public meetings did you have?
3. So,
That's a real comparison. We haven't talked much about risk, but how does mitigating risk matter to a developer? What causes risk in your business, and how can it be reduced? Either one.
I'm happy to jump in. This is really interesting because the nature of development in terms of the arc of real estate investment, it is at the highest level of risk. You're starting with nothing. You're going out and telling people this project's going to be 20, 30, 50 million, a small project really. Immediately the zeros add up, and we're going to we're going to build this and we're going to lease it. In 3 years, you're predicting the future, and things like COVID happen. And you're in a sector where you're trying to use industry to bring something to today's market with this constantly evolving code and these interpretations that Kathy mentioned when it comes to applying them in the field and interpretations by inspectors and different folks. It's a really messy process in terms of risk management, and this is where we go back to the pro forma. It is expected to yield a slightly higher return, and increasingly it doesn't. Hence, you're not seeing a lot of projects get built. And personally, I take risk very seriously because you need to have, if you're I consider myself an investor. I think developer sort of tends to be a dirty word because it implies I'm just like building something and then whatever, I'm not worried about it. But really, that doesn't exist anymore. Developers are savvy financial folks who know they have to compete and do a series of projects and have a lengthy career. And if you don't understand and can assess risk and explain it to your investors, you're not really going to succeed. And you're not going to succeed communicating with the city and the town and folks in the community who are looking to you for that leadership. Mitigating risk, I think, starts with an effective public engagement process, a really good planning department, a good economic development arm as well is key because they tend to understand the financial implications and are an objective outside party sort of attesting that we've looked and evaluated this project and we do believe there are some financial, for example, benefits. And then if you can, zoning is also important. I think Brookline adopting form-based zoning on Harvard is a step in the right direction. You need some flexibility. Because you know what, sometimes I'm not sure if we can pull off a rental project or a condo development. And that flexibility could mean the difference between the project succeeding at the point that it arrives to market and not. And sometimes it can be very restrictive. You're not allowed to at all modify the end use of a project, even if the market has shifted.
You talked a little bit about the difference between building condos and building rental property. Could you just go into that a little bit and how that differs, especially right now?
Yeah. I just want to make sure, though, just to finish sort of the risk evaluation. And the final kind of big piece of risk is escalation in costs. The time from which you evaluate the financial viability of a project to the time that you put a shovel in the ground, depending on the public process, could be 3 months to 2-3 years. During that time, costs have moved in a different direction, and you basically are now refinancing your project. And I think that's sort of where public engagement and good communication and an efficient process that gets you to that point where you can pull the trigger and you've kept your cost. Nobody locks in costs for longer than 3 months, maybe 6 months, is absolutely key. But to go and talk a little bit about this whole thing about housing, rental versus condos, I think what's happened in general and what I've seen happen in Brookline and in Boston is that increasingly we're shrinking the rental inventory of housing because they're getting converted to condos. There's more money per square foot in a condo project than there is in a rental project. Despite these crazy rent numbers that you see, inflationary costs, the cost of operating, taxes, utilities, are quite high, and it has compressed sort of returns on multifamily buildings. And I can tell you on some of the smaller projects that I've worked on, we almost have no cash in these buildings. We're just focused on breaking even, and then when we sell them, there's value appreciating. But that's kind of how, because it's so expensive for everyone to buy housing, it's actually very expensive to invest in apartment buildings. So it's become almost this very tight market in terms of how things flow, so everything makes a difference. And what I see in general is some distress where that conversion from rental housing stock to condos has left people with even fewer naturally occurring affordable opportunities for what I like to call accessible housing. It's the category of housing where we can access without any subsidies or public funding, because really, as Kathy mentioned, there's just such a vast need at that, at every level of housing. But even in the middle market, you're finding people living with roommates for a long time because, you could go into your 30s and 40s, you're going back home. All of this indicates that at that 2 or 3% vacancy for multifamily, we just don't have enough housing. The natural vacancy should be around 7-8 to start to see a market that's a little more favorable for tenants. Does that answer
That
a little
helps
bit on the
a lot.
condo and rental?
Can you address, Amy, what a 40B project is like and what and explain 40B briefly for us, and compared to building in Brookline under ordinary zoning, what are the costs and benefits of a 40B application?
So 40B is a much misunderstood piece of legislation. There's myths out there that you don't have to comply with any zoning, and you don't. It is a little more flexible, but really what it is a comprehensive permit. So instead of having to get 5 or 6 different permits, you can apply all at one time for all your permits. And so it is a more efficient process, and it is more flexible with some density bonuses for affordability and maybe parking bonuses. We did do, now there's friendly 40B and not friendly 40B. Friendly means the town is, or the city or town is supporting this concept and is working out details as opposed to really trying to fight you. So we did Brown as a friendly 40B. It did still take 28 public meetings, and we were 1.5 million into the project before we got our permits and could close on the financing. So all of that, just getting back to the risk question. Now, 40B makes that easier because it is a compressed process. Even though it took 2 years, it could be longer under 40A. But if we had not been successful, we would have lost 1.5 million with no way of recovering that.
Can I just kind of mention a couple of things maybe people here already know? But with 40B, even though I believe 25% of the units are affordable at 50% AMI,
It's 20% at 80, oh no, wait a minute, 25% at 80 and 20% at 50.
and these are just important
What's
concepts.
AMI?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Area meeting.
Area median income, and it's issued by HUD every year. What is the area median income? And 50% is considered very low and extremely low, and up to 80 is considered low income. So you have to do more if you're only doing low, and 20% if you're doing extremely low, which is very, 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 very hard to do without some public subsidy. But if you're doing a 40B where it's counted, oh, I'm sorry, that's not true, for leverage. Now I'm getting to inclusionary zoning. Let me take that back. It's another complexity. We can talk about inclusionary zoning. But to do below 50%, you really have to get public subsidies to sustain any units at 50% or below.
Because they're heavily subsidized.
Because the rent that the tenant can pay at 50% or below is going to be, so let's see, it's going to be $1,000 a month, or
Whereas a
50,
market rate for that apartment would be 3,000.
3,000, 2,500,
Okay.
3,000.
All right.
But I did kind of just want to mention that with 40B projects, what happens is DHCD calculates the entire DHCD, Department of Housing.
Doesn't
Housing
exist
and
anymore.
Community
It's now the
Development.
Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities.
Right.
When I worked there, it was DHCD.
Yeah.
It no longer is.
They will count the entire project towards the affordable inventory, which does have a term for
Yeah.
Brookline.
The
Yeah.
Affordable Housing
The
Inventory. You
Affordable
got it
Housing
right, yeah.
Inventory. Okay, AHI.
So that's the state housing agency.
Yeah, so we are, developers, we're trying to comply with many, many rules. And it is a maze of rules, but it's just important to kind of put it out there that we are beholden to all of these rules on how things are calculated. And it tends to be a benefit to the towns, that they end up meeting the entire inclusionary, inclusionary numbers, even if a project is only 20 or 25% affordable, once it hits that threshold. Does that make sense? Am I explaining
No,
that right?
that's
Okay.
right.
Brookline is a generally built-up community, a very old suburb,
Yeah.
with almost no undeveloped or unused land. Given that, what elements make any particular property attractive to each of you as developers? And how does the availability of affordable building sites affect your development decisions? What factors could influence affordability in a Brookline project?
Do you want to take that first?
You don't have to answer all those compound questions, but that's
No,
how
I mean,
the question was
it's
phrased.
hard, and as I mentioned, for us, we really need density to make the services work, because we're committed that, since we're owning it long-term, and we're committed that people will live with us for their full lives and almost never have to go to a nursing home, never have to leave us for any reason, then we have to be able to sustain it and provide those services. So there has to be density. There has to be an understanding about not a lot of parking, because that really drives up costs. And generally, at this point, you're looking at partnership. We were able to develop a partnership with Congregation Kahileth Israel. So, for example, one of the values of that partnership is we didn't pay for the site until we actually closed on all the financing, so that it was a definite going to happen. So we didn't take the risk of buying the land first. So a partnership where somebody
You
is
have
willing.
carrying costs before you built it.
Correct, no carrying costs on the land before we built it. So a partner that owns the site, that's willing to be patient for the patient capital so that we can pay. That is a critical factor for us, because it's very hard for us to have money to just buy the land completely at risk. So big enough with a good partner.
Good.
And I would add that, as you mentioned, there's really no lots in Brookline. If you're going to build something, you're going to build on top of something. You need zoning that's flexible. You need extra height. To demo a building and replace it means the cash flow is out the window. It's a very difficult proposition to build in Brookline. And because my business approach is to build sustainable housing that's accessible, I'm not a luxury developer, and Brookline really, by default, becomes a luxury market when a tiny lot is a couple of $1 million, and you can't have enough density to offset what the price per unit is. So you really get stuck fast in Brookline, and there's a contradiction between the type of housing we want and need and desire and sort of just the existing market conditions that are really bigger than all of us. And that just puts a lot of pressure on development that I think we're all looking for, that is a little more accessible, that might be more compact units, but still walkable, that might forgo some of the parking requirements. So we've got a long way to go before we can find actual mechanisms to enable that. And we've made progress, adopting some warrant articles where we're allowing, maybe a 2-family to add a 3rd unit, ADUs, accessory dwelling units. I have a lot of hope with these small interventions eventually adding up, because they allow for folks who own but are carrying taxes and very expensive ownership, of property in Brookline, to potentially find a source of income and stay in Brookline and become their own landlords and be sort of a compassionate landlord of a few units at a time, as opposed to solving it through very large developments, which tend to be quite controversial and difficult. But the issue continues to be, you can't cover your overhead really with less than 50 units. And I think it's very hard, and I'm not speaking on your behalf, Kathy, but tell me for an affordable project to be less than 100 units. I mean, $1.5 million, you mentioned, to get a project going. These are big numbers, and you're not guaranteed that you're going to get your permits. Somebody could change their mind, especially if you have a land option. So it's very risky space to be in, and you look for certainty on the political and on the public side in order to invest in a community.
Can you describe the typical zoning approval process from the point of view of a developer? How do you balance respect for community concerns like parking and building size, open space, and your ability to secure financing for a project? How does all that interact when you're going through a zoning approval process?
I'm happy to start here. It's really tricky because banks will not fund a project until it's fully permitted and approved. There is no such thing as coming up with an idea and then saying, oh yeah, now we've got the financing. You're really on your own with all of the upfront costs, and they're not recoverable. If you've paid too much for land and you need 10 units and somehow you interpret zoning in a way and your zoning attorney tells you, yeah, you can get 10, but you go to your public meetings and everyone says like, you can't get that extra 4th floor. You're at 8 units. You're in a position where you're like, okay, I'm going to eat my loss on the land, but I'm not going to go and try and build 8 units and eat an even bigger loss. So it gets very tricky fast. I think you have to be very astute. You have to spend a lot of time ensuring the proper interpretation of what you're buying and looking closely at zoning. Zoning is the law, and variances are not fun and are not a good basis for a project. Hence, the need to have some flexibility in how we write zoning to allow for more projects possibly to advance, especially the smaller ones, because the impact one unit has on the smaller deals is much greater than it does on larger deals.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add, it's very similar in the public finance sector because you can't actually apply for state funding until you've had all your permits and your design is done. They call it, you have to be shovel ready, meaning they give you the money and you could just put a shovel in and you could start moving. So you've got to do all of that before you apply for the state funding, and you don't know how long that's going to take. It could take 1 year, 2 years. Right now, some stuff's looking like 3 years out. So you're taking all that risk.
Oh, could you talk, you've mentioned inclusionary zoning. Could you talk a little bit about what that is and how that affects what you're doing as a developer and what you plan to develop?
Sure, although since what we do is 100% affordable, we don't have any inclusionary zoning requirements because everything's included. But what inclusionary zoning says is if you build a market apartment, I forget what the formula is here
Yeah,
now. Is it 15%?
I have some numbers,
Yeah, go
thanks to some folks who've helped me earlier. So for Brookline, 12 to 15% of the units would need to be affordable at 50% AMI, 12% at 50% AMI, or 15% of all the units in a project would have to be affordable at 80% of area median income for market rate projects. And this is something that developers, we just put in the pro forma on day one, pretty much inclusionary zoning, except in some towns. I think Lynn may not have. Did Lynn have inclusionary?
We're building 100% affordable.
100. So in some towns, they haven't adopted any inclusionary zoning requirements, but those are pretty standard and mainstream, and they're everywhere. But the level of affordability is what may vary, and I'm very pleased that Brookline, during sort of recently, has started to suggest slightly higher affordability, but more flexibility, incentivizing commercial on the ground floor. I think active streets and good urban planning and walkable sidewalks and good residential neighborhoods are rooted in this concept of housing on top and commercial on the bottom. And anytime you try to ask for both, retail tends to be subsidized by the building. It's not really a moneymaker. You really do need to look at how much you're asking for inclusionary housing on top. And I'm speaking sort of in terms of smaller projects, not large buildings, those, 2-3 story buildings with a small commercial unit on the first floor. Because there you put a lot of pressure. And again, you're sort of hearing from us what it's like to deal with the same problem at a different scale.
And the other thing, the difference between inclusionary zoning, which I mistakenly almost talked about before, and a 40B or other is the concept of inclusionary zoning. Someone may not agree with me on this, but I'm fairly confident that you're not supposed to get public subsidies, that the idea is the inclusionary units that you build should be subsidized by the market value of the other units. Whereas when I do just 100% affordable, I'm depending on public financing. So inclusionary zoning is not supposed, so when you say you have whatever percentage you're supposed to do in Brookline, you're not supposed to get public finance to do that, which is very different than anything else.
You're actually not eligible for really anything. It's,
If you're for profit.
No. It's just that the threshold is considered that if you can't make a project pencil by including 12 or 15% affordable, go somewhere else. It's really that simple. So that just, you can look at it in whichever way you want to see it. It's a requirement to enter the arena, is the project has to. And so in a market like Brookline, where rents are very strong, it's not an issue. But in other markets, it disincentivizes development. So in Brookline, it's really sort of not unreasonable, I think, to ask for that on market rate deals. Yeah.
And just to be clear, it doesn't matter if you're for-profit or non-profit. The inclusionary zoning is neutral about that. And the state finance agencies do finance affordable housing by for-profit developers. So it's not
I see.
whether you're for-profit or non-profit. It's whether it's for inclusionary, which you're supposed to be able to pay for your own, or you're doing an amount on top of that, which is understood to need public resources.
And the reason this is so interesting is because ultimately, whether you're a for-profit or not-for-profit developer, you face the same market conditions. And if you have the skill set and the team and you want to keep everyone working, and there's a really important need for an affordable housing project, what this, and because the state wants competition, they want the best people to compete for that money. What you see is people saying, developers looking at it as like, maybe I should do this project. It's 100% affordable, but it's good to kind of keep everyone busy during a downturn. The public sources for funding exist at times when the private market sources dry up. So you'll find that fluidity, which often, I appreciate you mentioning it, Kathy, because people really think that there's silos that exist in different spheres, but they really do intersect.
Brookline has a number of climate change mitigation regulations for new buildings. How do those kinds of regulations affect your ability to build new multifamily housing? Do they add value to your project because the energy costs are reduced or whatever? Can you just address that for us? Because those
Sure.
have been something we've passed recently very frequently in town meeting.
That's why I wanted to talk about life cycle costing at the beginning and the fact that we're end users as well. Because we, as a matter of philosophy, none of our residents pay for their own utilities. They control the climate in their apartments, but they don't pay for utilities. So we have a big incentive. So we've done everything to the highest level of sustainability. Our last few buildings are, actually, we have the largest passive house building, multifamily building in New England now, which is the highest standard. So, and there's no magic. If things cost more to build up front, you have to get more financing. I mean, yes, we think about the long term because we're long-term owners, but if you add more and more regulations onto what it costs to build up front, it costs more and you have to get more money. It's not a magical
Right.
thing. And it makes perfect sense to think about the long-term costs.
Yeah, I would add that, we can't go back. I think everybody understands that the rules of engagement around the environment are long-term plans to effectively solve for our carbon footprint. The technology, the awareness is here. I'm Passive House certified. I've built Passive House buildings for market projects. Certainly, I would say margins compress, but I don't want to work in an industry that doesn't live up to the times. And I think what really happens is that I will choose to do fewer projects and less projects will pencil, but maybe that's the cost of operating to the level that I believe I want to be in. And the passive house and the high energy sort of the efficiency aspects of building today feel good, but they haven't saved people a ton of money, because ultimately, every month, if you're saving $100 on your utility cost and your mortgage is a big chunk of money or your rent is very expensive, but it has had some really great benefits in other ways because the buildings are so tight. You have air, purifying systems, and especially during COVID, when I was building Passive House, we sold those Passive House units because of the ventilation systems in like no time. There was just such a heightened awareness. And we've integrated solar. Those are all the things of sort of that I think, I'm so glad you asked that question because they make me excited about buildings because they're not about contention. We're all agreeing that we need to do something. And it's a little bit unfortunate that at times we're not taking the time to sort of celebrate the projects that do achieve that. We sort of ask for it and then we forget. But there's really a huge commitment on the part of very skilled folks, especially with, on the part of all the committees that have forged through code with inclusion around adopting the passive house energy model to comply with energy code. These are people who on their own spare time, engineers and folks who are very enlightened in the industry who found a way to make this code. And I think we owe them a lot. And I think that's very exciting that Brookline is super aware around the importance to be very sustainable in the future.
Michael, do you have some questions from the audience, either in-house or outside?
I just got a couple. Let me review them, but there's one question before that, which has to do with sort of appearance and what a building looks like and how much that affects the cost of the building or whether or not it can move forward, and how much you take that into account in your development process, just the aesthetics.
I think the aesthetics are a big part of the permitting process. And we're very committed to a long-term positive aesthetic because we're not, as I mentioned, we're also advocates. So if affordable housing always looks like dumpy or boring, it's just not going to help advance the cause that it can enhance your neighborhood. I think if those of you who've seen Brown House, I think it's really attractive. The bakery on the ground floor is a very exciting place where our residents meet people in the neighborhood. And we spent a lot of time and money on the exterior of the building, and I think that's money well spent. But it is expensive to make it look nicer, no question.
I think we have no option but to make the most attractive buildings because really the public process is all about vetting what you're proposing and how a building hits the street. And I think there's really no way around it. And it's just part of it. It's part of the process.
There's one question here about funding. How do you fund units at 80% to 120% AMI? Is that borne by the developer?
I would say, so this is a really good question because you're talking about what we call workforce housing funding. 80% to 120% AMI is eligible under mass housing for workforce housing funds. But my understanding is that workforce housing funds have been used more, and tell me, Kathy, if this is right, for affordable housing projects to pencil and not so much for projects looking to do workforce housing to pencil.
We've
Yeah.
gotten it for what we do, but
but that is a vehicle that is very limited in terms of state funding that I think is really important, and probably I would just wish it was bigger and more substantial because I think it would meet a market need that's a little bit somewhat overlooked, especially in towns like Brookline where your house could have a lot of equity in it, but you really are cash poor. And I think that's the dilemma in affluent communities where they struggle with the same pains of housing, but oftentimes are not really, very few people are empathetic to someone who lives in Brookline because they'll just assume that, they were able to buy into Brookline. But if you bought into Brookline 20, 30 years ago when Brookline wasn't as expensive and your property has appreciated, that's a story of a different way of, entering Brookline. And it would be really hard today for young families to enter or for firefighters or teachers. I'd say I would get very frustrated that most of my kids' teachers in the school were not living in Brookline and they were commuting an hour. I would love to see more housing for our teachers and all of the folks who make our town livable and great.
Yeah, and can I congratulate the Brookline Housing Advisory Board because they were very supportive. So actually, I have to credit them for the whole thing. When we were building Brown House, they wanted, I think there's 5 levels of affordability. Even though it's only 62 apartments, some of them are 80 to 110%, and they were very willing to put town money in the project overall. So that included, we have 10 units that are either 3 market 7, 80 to 110%. And Brookline Hab did give us town money to support the construction of those and the maintenance of those. So
That's great.
Brookline's very forward-thinking that way.
Good.
Or at least the Housing Advisory Board and the Planning Board are.
There are a couple of questions having to do with Brookline town government and what we can do to make development more possible to encourage and enable new units. So, for example, Brookline has changed the zoning on Harvard Street with the hope of encouraging more housing. How else can Brookline government and citizens encourage and enable new units?
I would say it starts with everyone here and all of us advocating for projects in a positive manner. And I'm not saying we agree to everything that gets proposed, but I think it's very easy to say no to everything. It's a lot harder to sit and say, I can live with this and I'll deal with the construction and the traffic issues for 2 years for a project to get built. And so there's no easy way around the pain. There is a lot of inconvenience around new development when it occurs. It does congest, it does impact parking, it impacts your quality of life. And a lot of times, even for me personally, I'll think of oh my gosh, as a developer, sometimes I'm like annoyed when there's a development down the street from me. I think it's human nature for us to be resistive to change and resistive to and longing for sort of how things were. And I respect that. It's also how you protect a community. But I think we're just really smart people who overthink things sometimes. And then we get in our own way of doing something. And sometimes you just have to allow things to happen and maybe vet the players and invite people maybe, instead of sort of being, when you set an idea and understanding of what the journey is going to be like for investors and developers to come to Brookline, I think you probably get what you want, as opposed to kind of creating the appearance of not wanting anyone. Because then you'll get somebody who'll say, oh, I'm going to do a 40B project because you didn't approve. I just think it has to be a process where we communicate and advocate for what we believe in. And I would say create some leniency for smaller scale projects in terms of density. It's not a crime if a 3-unit building turns into a 5-unit building, but you really can't do it. The zoning is so clear. But those are just, I think, areas that we should just need to be more flexible with.
So there is an affordable housing overlay district that is meeting, and that offers the real potential if you can increase density, reduce parking, have some as of right multifamily, and that would be enormous. And the other thing would be limiting the time of the permitting. And 40B does have a limit, but then they always say to the developer, well, we need a little more. You really have to say yes, of course we can have more, but time is definitely money and risk. So, but density and parking are the two biggest drivers of what would make it more
and I want
easy.
And I kind of challenge you to think about parking as the subtle way to stop projects, because parking requirements and curb cuts really truly are the backstop on what you can build. I've seen, when I look at sort of the massing and the volume of what we can build on the site, before I hit the parking requirement, then it all of a sudden falls apart. There has to be some way where we can, every time we park a car, we take a unit away from someone to live in it. I mean, maybe not 2 or 3 cars is a unit. It's important to know that we got to pick, what do we want? Bike lanes, sidewalks? Everything's going to shrink the more we add programming to our city. And increasingly we're unrealistic, I think, about what compromises we're willing to make. And same thing with housing. If we don't accept some reduction in parking, we're not going to be able to achieve that density at a reasonable height. And so something has to give. But these dialogues are really important.
Agreed.
Great. You've talked a little bit about regulation and the public process. There's a specific question here. If a 1-story building is demolished, how do you think about the minimum height of a new building in order to be viable for such a site?
I mean, historically, urban planning principles, zoning is based on what the urban fabric already has. That the right thing to do is to comply. And I think that's a little bit of a dated approach that hasn't yielded the results that we need in housing. And this is where, what Kathy mentioned about zoning. Zoning is not just about today, it's about the vision for the future. So the acceptable height from the perspective of the community would be that 1-story house that was there before. But from the perspective of today's market, where we have no land and we need more housing, is different. And that's the disconnect between, again, what is passable, what the community might want, what we visualize is what we already have, right? It's harder to visualize what we don't have. And then the issues of what height will also impact shadows and light and create a hostile street. So you go back really to urban planning principles and what's digestible and what is acceptable. And it's hard to answer without a project site to look at. But I'm just sharing with you some of the tension points that we have to often balance. And it's not, I mean, I wouldn't go to a single family home housing district and try and build a 3-story building, because I know the zoning probably won't let me. But if the zoning evolved in a way where there was some identification of maybe buildings that were in disarray, that were an opportunity for redevelopment in a different way, that would be, I think, a sound approach.
And can I just mention that height and width are the trade-offs? So if you have a site that's this big and you build only 2 stories, and you have to build right to the lot lines. If you can go to 3 or 4 stories, then you can pull it back and have a little courtyard, or a little, like in front of Brown House, we have that little loop-de-de-loop. It's not really a park, it's a loop-de-de-loop thing where people can sit, and I always see people sitting there having coffee and doing that. So if you limit height too much, you push width out, and you just have to think about that, because height offers the chance to do more courtyards and spaces for public gatherings.
We need an urban planner on the panel here to respond to that question. So any volunteers?
Great. Here's a specific question that I'm actually not familiar with. Have either of you been in touch with the governor's office regarding the One Commonwealth initiative? This is focused on ensuring residents have access to affordable housing and increasing housing production.
I haven't.
So I'm puzzled about what I'm on the Governor's Housing Advisory Council, and we're looking at all of the housing policies. So I have a feeling I might be, but I don't know it by that name. So can someone tell me what they meant? Because I might have more familiarity. Okay. What did?
It's a recent initiative by Governor Healy, along with the housing bond bill, with $800 million for affordable housing that was passed by the legislature. She put together an initiative called the One Commonwealth Project. And I'm just curious if they've reached out to Brookline. And I know they're just in their new phases and stages, so I figured I would ask the developer.
Repeat what he said.
Go ahead. Do you want to repeat that? Yeah.
I can't repeat it all, but it's, apparently it's connected to Governor Healy's housing bond bill, and there's $800,000. Would you
Million.
stand up so I can hear you better?
Yeah, sorry. The 800, it's affiliated with $800 million, it's part of the housing bond bill, the $800 million for affordable housing, and it's a new initiative by the governor, and I didn't know if she's reached out to developers yet, or her team has or anything. Just trying to understand where it is, and if you've gotten involved with it.
And is it for a special portion of the population, or like?
It's all about housing production across the state.
So,
Charlie,
oh.
the Commonwealth is, right now it is primarily focused on organizing and supporting implementation of the MBTA Community Act.
Okay.
That's what the group is working on right at the moment. They have their monthly calls. They have funds that are then available for communication and organizing and supporting efforts right now.
Got it.
And if you're interested, I can give you the contact information for the person
Great.
that's coordinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Okay. One last question. Well, that one we sort of already answered. You've talked a little bit about the public meeting process. Are there any other sort of specific perspectives or requests or things that would be helpful in making that move forward from a citizen's perspective that you can share?
I mean, the public meeting process has a long way to improve. We have technology today that we're not using. I know the startup I sit on the board, Co-Urbanize, was founded by an MIT planner who was like, this is ridiculous. We go back and you present the same project every time you start a meeting, and we go back to square one. And she has a platform where public comments are tallied, responses are tracked. We asked for this, did we get it? And I think we increasingly need to just document the process, because no one can retain the information in that long public approvals process. But I also do think that we need better planning objectives so that we are tracking against clear criteria of what is important for a project. And I think that's at the heart of it is, are we talking about the same thing, and can we agree on what every project is going to accomplish? Because no one project can accomplish everything. And we do have different housing needs and different needs from different areas of our city. And sometimes if we can get a great active retail use out of a project, maybe that's all the project can handle, that's a success. I think we need to measure the success of these projects a little differently, and not against maybe what our own expectations are for what we want, because oftentimes what we want may not be what somebody else needs. And I don't see enough objectivity around, for this 50 units of affordable housing, we achieved, we served this segment of our community. But for this market rate project, we served firefighters and, young, successful folks who can afford to come to Brookline and contribute to our tax base. I just think we need more objectivity around, and less subjectivity and more objective goals around what projects accomplish, and then to share them with folks and track so that we know how we're doing. And I don't think we're tracking enough how many units are at a deficit today from against what we need. And I'm not talking about just the affordable market, just general housing.
All of it. So I would offer my observation. We have a very sophisticated planning board with people who really do understand the development process and add a lot. And I think the question for all of us as a town is the one you posed earlier, is what's the trade-off between time and how much improvement, and how many individual, the time thing, like we could go through 6 meetings and a 7th person, someone shows up and suddenly has a new objection because they live around the corner and they weren't paying attention, then we go back. So we had 28 public meetings. The project definitely improved over the 28 meetings. Did it improve 28 times? I don't know, but every time a new abutter, or not even an abutter, a new neighbor comes with yet a new complaint, we tend to stop and go back and look again. And maybe that's good, but it is a factor. So I think it's less. We really do have a very sophisticated planning board who is delightful in terms of really grasping the concepts and working with us. And how much do we meet every neighborhood concern, and how long are we willing to hold it open for that?
Thank you. I have one final question. So in a world where you can assume more relaxed zoning, are there areas of Brookline or different kinds of geographies that you think would be particularly interesting or available to increase our housing or to do mixed-use construction?
I think the MBTA Communities Act, the way it was designed and advanced here, was brilliant, because it's transit access, right? So Brown House has no resident parking, and we still have 896 people on the waiting list, and they all know there's no parking. So where there's really good transit, and having the bakery in the ground floor is phenomenal. Mm-hmm. It's so great to have that mix use and to be in a vibrant commercial area. So the idea that Harvard Street corridor is ripe for more density, I think, is quite brilliant, and congratulations to that committee that figured that out, because I think it's totally right on.
Yeah, I would add we have tremendous opportunity on Boylston Street to replan it, re-envision it, to really rezone it, to deal with traffic, and to make it walkable. I would love nothing more than to bike down Harvard and on Boylston and enjoy it. Right now, it's a little hostile for walking, and it's a shame, and biking, and it's a shame because there's so much potential for increased density, for height, larger sites, and we really have to sort of take on that challenge of dealing and confronting that that part of Brookline may not look as quaint as the Village, but that it could potentially be an important place to get significant housing built. I think Harvard Street is tremendous, but Harvard Street is still special in the sense that it's so walkable, and you want to keep that light. So it didn't really increase density. The MBTA Act did not increase density significantly along Harvard Street, but I do think there's an opportunity to do so selectively on some parcels if we are flexible and open to accepting, 8-story buildings on lots that are large enough, as Kathy mentioned, that can step back from the street, provide the public open space, and really meet us where we want to be.
And following up on that, there's another question about the MBTA zoning having to do with timeframes. How is the MBTA zoning bill going to actually begin to manifest, and what are we going to see built and when?
If only I could predict the future, and I would go in and I think with the MBTA zoning act, there was a lot of good faith on the part of Brookline as a community and as a town in saying we welcome housing, we want to be inclusive. And I think Brookline really did an outstanding job stating out front that we're going to find a way to comply. And the process was remarkable and meeting those deadlines. I would say the biggest shift in thinking was to form-based zoning, which I'm not an expert in, but form-based zoning allows for greater flexibility for the planners to determine that a project can comply without being too formulaic to certain criteria in zoning. I think that's a positive step, but I think everything we do in Brookline is always with the mind of not too much too fast, and it's yet to be seen whether the rezoning along Harvard is going to induce development. It's nice to have a form of compliance. It's much harder to predict whether existing 2-3-story buildings that are already a couple of million each would turn into a viable larger project at, with an extra floor. I think, we're always a little timid around what it would really take to change things because it's hard to change and it's scary, and I understand it, but we have yet to see. It's too soon since we've adopted MBTA zoning to know what the result will be.
But let me invite everyone to get in touch with me and come tour Brown House, which is 6 stories, and I think you will find it anything but scary. And you should come see it up close and personal.
Can I follow up on that? I asked that question.
Yeah.
So, what is it at? There was a lot of talk about what's that going to actually mean? And so, and I'm a real estate agent. I still have no clue. To me, it sounds like, oh, well, there's that dog grooming shop on Harvard. They're just going to throw 2 stories on top of it and put housing there. And so that's kind of, and discussing it with my wife, who's a 30-year resident, she's like, oh, I kind of like the idea of putting, housing above retail, but when Zeina just mentioned, that I forgot the word you used, but I think it has to do with actually like the stresses on the actual building.
Mm-hmm.
You can maybe throw an attic above your house, but
Right.
you throw 2 stories of housing over,
Yeah.
So that's what really my question, are we ever going to actually see it? Does it mean we're going to tear apart what's already down there to be able to build up? How is it actually going to work? Because you're right, it sounds great. It was wonderful that our town jumped right on it. But is it ever going to happen? How's it going to happen? And what's it going to end up looking like?
Yeah, it's piece by piece. I think you start to look at assemblages where a number of buildings can be assembled into a larger site that then might look something closer to what Amy described, a 6-story building, maybe with 20, 30, 40 units. I think those types of that type of scale is more viable than someone saying, I have a brownstone, a triple-decker, and I'm going to add a 4th floor. That's when the building buckles. And the level of sophistication that it takes to add a floor to a building and the type of engineering and testing, no one wants to take that on. You really quickly, in my mind, you won't see a major movement if we're not more agreeable and actually open and saying that we will allow more height. And I think, the MBTA compliance just occurred. It almost feels like yesterday. There were a lot of long discussions, and am I ready now to kind of go and start to say, let's see what can we do to allow more height? But I feel almost like as citizens, we really should, because we understand what is going on, and we're going to have to get, again, more flexible. Amy said on zoning, density, and parking.
The Harvard Street has a 4-story living now.
Right.
That I suspect is going to be a killer for much happening.
A 4-story is not high enough, I'd say. To really incentivize anyone to go from 3 to 4, it's not going to move the needle fast anytime soon. It's better than 3, but it's still not dramatic.
Mm-hmm. So this next question is, let me just read it. Many people believe building more housing will ultimately lower costs. Others believe Brookline is too attractive, and the volume of housing doesn't matter. What do you think is the answer? Do the numbers matter?
Oh yeah, the numbers matter. I mean, I think there's an understanding, and I do believe these numbers because I've seen it firsthand. Maybe it's more the commercial sector, but around 7% vacancy is like the naturally happy medium in a market, and we're at 2% vacancy in Brookline for rental housing. That's too low. That means that you don't have an option, that you settle for an apartment with one window and a second bedroom that doesn't have a window. I mean, that's not healthy, I think. The market, from a market perspective, we do need more volume in order to achieve a variety of housing, buildings with elevators for anyone who is going through a disability or is unable to easily go upstairs. People are stuck, and a lot of people are stuck in big homes because they don't have an option. We don't have enough housing variety for different housing needs through different cycles of life. And I don't think Brookline all of a sudden will become a great deal or a really inexpensive place to live in, but at least, I mean, if you're going to spend all this money, have some choices. Because in many ways, we're all stuck spending what we need to spend to live in Brookline and benefit from all the wonderful resources it has to offer. But it'd be nice to have a few more options.
And I guess I would say the laws of supply and demand somewhat apply. There's a lot of things that skew it, but we are so undersupplied for, I mean, the fact that we have 896 people on a waiting list for 62 units is indication of a imbalance in supply and demand. But let's be honest and be patient. It's not going to be 2 more brown houses are going to change we need a lot. I mean, the state estimates 200,000 new units before we're going to see any impact on the ratio of supply and demand. So we have to be aggressive and patient if we want more supply to affect the pricing.
And just because I sit on the Economic Development Advisory Board for Brookline, I mean, I'm really excited about also us envisioning our commercial tax base increase as well as our housing tax base increase in a way that's reasonable so that you're not dealing with property taxes. You know, we're primarily a residential community, and I would love to see us also incentivize commercial development so that we can get more of that tax benefit. And it is a balancing act around being flexible on height, because once you get a taller office building or lab building, naturally the residential buildings are going to be taller because the taboo of is height acceptable here is gone. And I think with Brookline, because we are primarily residential, single family, or maybe 2-3 family homes, we've never really naturally had height. So we're always fearful of it.
I couldn't agree more. I've been in town meeting for so long, and I've wondered all this time why we can't have more commercial development in Brookline, and why it is that Somerville and Boston and Cambridge and all these neighboring communities, Wellesley too, have so much more income that doesn't come from property tax, that comes from their commercial lives, and it makes, as we've seen on Harvard Street, it makes life so much happier for people if there's commercial as well as residential in easy distance, in easy reach of everyone.
There is a lot of resistance. I will tell you, when we were building the hotel in Coolidge Corner, people picketed my home, saying I was ruining the town. There was a letter to the editor saying I was the flat tire on the wheel of life because
At least it's creative.
there was an op-ed piece that said town has great staff. Everyone is an A+ except for Amy Schectman, who's an F- because of the hotel, which I think we would all agree has not been the end of Coolidge Corner as we know it. So it can, I mean, I just want to kind of, I mean, these are kind of funny in retrospect. What wasn't, and I was telling you this before, wasn't funny. One day I was in Trader Joe's with my son, who was then, I think, 10 or 11, and we were just waiting on the line to pay for our groceries. This was on a weekend, and some woman took my 10-year-old son, and do you know your mother has been the ruin of this town? I don't even want to live here anymore. She's wrecked it for everyone, and no one should ever have to deal with your mother. She is the worst person in the world. And my poor son started sobbing, and we had to leave. There's human impacts of these things. I just want to, it's, in retrospect, it's a little funny. It wasn't,
I just want to kind of commend Amy, because to be a developer is really to do a public service. Ultimately, you are creating housing. No one sees it that way, but you are subject to public meetings where you are personally attacked. And I think I admire Amy for choosing to work in the town that she loves, because I did not make that choice. I do not work in Brookline because I live in Brookline. And it's a very conscious decision to kind of protect my family from sort of attacks that I don't think are reasonable, and people get very emotional when it comes to development and buildings. And I wonder if it's sort of the last space where we meet in a public forum and all of our issues and challenges come out, even if it's not really the forum where the challenges that we might be facing in our city need to be discussed. But that's a real consideration to a process that doesn't at all protect the advocate for housing. It's kind of a very kind of controversial place to be, where you're asked to come and provide economic development, but you're also attacked at the same time. And I've never been able to kind of understand it fully, because I'm not the only one, and Amy's not the only one who does this because we believe in it. There's a lot of people, and I wonder how many people haven't come to Brookline because they feel that this may not be a welcoming community for them, and how much money we've lost in terms of economic development and investment. That really does worry me, because I feel if we know what we want to put out, we will attract the right types of folks to develop our community, especially as we look towards commercial development. You really have to be on your A game with economic development to attract the large commercial players, because everyone courts them. Every town, Somerville courts them. We've seen Watertown, it's on fire. And we're not at a great time, because there's been 10 years where that growth has been occurring in our neighboring, just down the street in Watertown and Somerville, and we've missed that growth. And so we're starting again from scratch now to rebuild those connections and say, but we will zone for life science, and we will welcome, and we got to build that muscle and go out and advocate for it.
Well, on that note, I want to say thank you both very much.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation, and I really, on behalf of all of us, appreciate your honest and unvarnished perspective, and we hope to have more perspectives to share with the community as well. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors for this forum again, the Brookline Community Development Corporation, Brookline for Everyone, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, GBIO Brookline, the Brookline Planning Board, the Brookline Housing Advisory Board, and the Brookline Housing Authority. We will be making a recording of this evening's conversation available from the Yes in Brookline website, and stay tuned for an email with the details. Yes in Brookline is planning more conversations like this one, providing other perspectives on housing in Brookline. We look forward to welcoming you to these conversations as well. You can also learn about housing and land use in Brookline through the Planning and Community Development Department page at brooklinema.gov, as well as brooklinecomplan.com for information about the Brookline Comprehensive Plan kickoff on October 9th and how to get involved in that process. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and participating in this discussion. And on behalf of Yes in Brookline, good night. Thank you.